Dr. Tharoor, please, I won't say too much. It's time for your idea of India.
Thank you very much. Shri Datta Naik, whom we've just honored, Shantaji, Dr. Ganesh Devi, who heads the Dakshinayanan, Shri Vinod Shirsat, Shri Avdat Timblo, my senior at school and classmate of the brother of my classmate, Advocate Cleofato Coutinho, Dr. Francisco Colasso, I think is not, there he is. Other distinguished members of the audience, I know there are too many to mention. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, I hope that covers everybody. My greetings to all of you and a very happy New Year. It's indeed a pleasure for me to join you this evening in celebrating the 70th birthday of one of Goa's most illustrious sons. Rarely does one come across someone who straddles the worlds of entrepreneurship and literature with such finesse, excelling in each and utilizing them not for personal gain or aggrandizement, but as powerful tools to facilitate social reform. Over the past 5 decades, by dint of his towering business acumen and remarkable literary prowess, which in many ways are knit together by his profound commitment to humanist values, Datta Damodar Naik has forged an industrious legacy. An intellectual beyond compare, he has a grounding in economics and statistics, which he bolstered by obtaining management training from such hallowed institutions as IIM Ahmedabad and IIM Lucknow. In the process, he cultivated an incisive and creative mind that represents a confluence of entrepreneurial zeal and public spiritedness. Naik first forayed into business in 1975 when he joined his family's 6th-generation-old business and perhaps even to his own surprise began blazing an outstanding trail. Once at the helm, he transformed the enterprise into a sprawling conglomerate, its roots spreading out into such diverse sectors as farming, food processing, retail, logistics, and housing. A prolific and prodigiously multilingual writer of fiction and non-fiction alike, Datta Naik has a knack for plumbing the depths of the human condition. Through his works in Konkani, Marathi, and English, which have been widely translated into Hindi as well, he has enriched our nation's intellectual, literary, and public discourse. To my mind, the secular, progressive, and rationalist thrust of his work stems from his love of science and philosophy. In 2006, he won the Sahitya Academy Award for Jai Ki Jui, which is a sterling collection of essays in Konkani, carving a niche for himself in India's literary hall of fame. A redoubtable proponent of civil society leadership, Datta Naik has founded several organizations that undertake social reform and philanthropic projects at the grassroots, striving to uplift some of our weakest fellow citizens. Aside from founding the first student organization of Goa, he's played an outstanding role, a pivotal role in establishing the Goa chapter of the Dakshinayan Abhiyan, and has also been associated with the Samta Andolan and the Lok Shakti. His steadfast participation in all these movements reflects his commitment to creating a more plural, peaceful, and progressive India, brimming, he hopes, as we all do, with justice, fraternity, and egalitarianism. With a heart full of compassion and an unwavering faith in humanist values, Datta Naik has presided over such vigorous organizations as this one, the Gomanth Vidya Niketan, and the Samaj Seva Sangh, through which he has sought to preserve and promote Goa's immensely rich cultural and intellectual heritage, hoping to ensure that it's not only protected but celebrated. Ultimately, underpinning all of his avatars, the philanthropic businessman, the secular and rationalist writer, the public-spirited and tireless social reformer, is the fact of his being a devoted congressman. In fact, I'd argue that his years in the Indian National Congress have buttressed the rationalist within him, enabling him to undertake his other responsibilities with even greater sagacity. After all, to be a member of the Congress is to come face to face with its majestic history, a history of luminaries who not only won India her freedom, but also pioneered the idea of India from which emerged our pluralist and progressive constitution, which we've just celebrated the 75th anniversary of. In my view, there's no better way of honoring a patriotic, democratic-minded, secular and rational Indian like Datta Naik than by reflecting on this idea of India, which I'm sure animates him and has spurred him on, as Ganesh Devi said, from success to success throughout his splendid years of public service. You've asked me to say a few words about the painting, but I think the painter himself has done so far more effectively than I could. I did notice the fisherman's hook and was thinking of a metaphor to describe its appropriateness, but I think the painter has captured it perfectly for the writer in Datta Naik, and perhaps also for the spirit of public service through which he has hooked the people of this lovely state. So getting to my topic of the idea of India, the phrase is Rabindranath Tagore's. It is in some form or the other arguably as old as antiquity itself, and numerous are the proofs of aspiration for cultural unity that appear throughout the history of our civilization. In my book, An Era of Darkness, I've dwelled upon how the notion of Bharatvarsha and the Rig Veda, of a land stretching from the Himalayas to the seas, contained the original territorial idea of India. How the travels of Adi Shankara at the cusp of the 10th century, when he crisscrossed the length and breadth of India, establishing his mutts in Srinagar, Dwarka, Puri, Sringeri, brought to life what the Harvard Indologist Diana Eck described as a sacred geography of India, knit together by countless tracts of pilgrimage. But lest this be viewed as a purely Hindu notion, even Maulana Abul Kalam Azad wrote of how Indian Muslims on the Hajj were all viewed by the Arabs as Hindis, for whether they were Kashmiris or Keralites, Punjabis or Pathans, they were all from Hindustan. Now, while this sentiment is centuries old, it was immortalized in 1905 by an extraordinary young lecturer at the Government College in Lahore. A philosopher, poet, and polyglot, this gentleman was called upon to address a meeting of a patriotic body of Indian students. But with little time to prepare a speech, he chose instead to recite a hymn he'd just written, taking not only his audience in Lahore, but the entire subcontinent by storm, so that in the years thereafter, this hymn became the rallying song of Indian nationalism. Sare jahan se acha, sang Allama Muhammad Iqbal, Hindustan Hamara. And then in the sixth stanza of the Tarana-e-Hind, he stirringly summarized a key element of the idea of India that would be enshrined in the Constitution of India. Mazhab nahi sikhata apas mein bair rakhna, Hindi hai hum, watan hai Hindustan hamara. Now religion, wrote Iqbal, apparently speaking as much to our polarized age as his own, does not teach us to bear animosity towards one another. We are all Indians and India is our homeland. Though he himself betrayed this idea later in life, the idea outlived him. He was, after all, recalling an idea of India as a single civilization, straddling a specific geography, a shared history, and countless faiths, languages, ethnicities, and cultures, all harmonized into a dazzling kaleidoscopic whole, an idea that was truly timeless. However, the idea of India as a democratic nation, based on a certain conception of human rights and citizenship, vigorously backed by due process of law and equality before the law, is a relatively recent and strikingly modern idea. Older conceptions of India drew their inspiration from mythology and theology. We also have examples of sabhas and samitis, even the highly sophisticated bhikshu sanghas of the Buddhists, where kingdoms and even empires were run along democratic lines, spanning from the grassroots in the form of panchayats and councils to the royal darbars, where kings and emperors sought the counsel of learned and wise elders. This tradition is important to recall, for it confirms that in ancient India both majority and minority opinions were given due importance in the formulation of public policy. This was no mean feat in a nation and society as heterogeneous as ours, with its numberless socio-religious identities and groups. However, the modern idea of India, despite the mystical influence of Tagore, all these roots we've traced into antiquity, and the spiritual and moral influence of Mahatma Gandhi, is today a robustly secular and constitutional construct, based essentially upon the vision and intellect of our founding fathers, notably, in alphabetical order, Ambedkar, Nehru, and Patel. When, at the stroke of midnight, on 15th August 1947, Nehru heralded the dawn of India's freedom, he proclaimed a tryst with destiny. It was a moment, he said, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends and the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. With these words, he launched India into a remarkable experiment in democratic governance. Remarkable in some ways because it was happening at all. India, Winston Churchill had once barked, as merely a geographical expression. It's no more a single country, Churchill said, than the equator. Now, Churchill was rarely right about India, but it's true that no other country in the world embraces the extraordinary mixture of ethnic groups, the profusion of mutually incomprehensible languages, the varieties of topography and culture and climate, the diversity of religions and cultural practices, and the range of levels of economic development that India embraces. And yet India is more than the sum of its contradictions. Merely thinking about our country makes clear the enormity of the challenge of defining what it means to be an Indian. How should one approach this land of snow peaks and tropical jungles, with 22 major languages recognized in the Constitution, 22,000 distinct dialects, including some spoken more widely than Danish or Norwegian or Estonian, and with the world's largest population comprising individuals of every ethnic extraction and practicing every faith known to humanity? How does one gauge a culture which elevated non-violence to an effective moral principle, but whose freedom was born in blood and whose independence still soaks in it? How can one determine the future of an ageless civilization that was the birthplace of 4 major religions, a dozen different traditions of classical dance, 85 major political parties, and 300 ways of cooking the potato? Well, it's often said that any truism about India can be immediately contradicted by another truism about India. Our country's national motto, emblazoned on our governmental crest, is Satyameva Jayate, truth alone triumphs. The question remains, however, whose truth? It's a question to which, in the world's most populous nation, there are 1.4 billion answers. But that sort of answer is no answer at all. And so another answer to those questions has to be sought. And this may lie in a simple insight. The singular thing about India is that you can only speak of it in the plural. There are, in the hackneyed phrase, many Indias. Everything exists in countless variants. There is no single standard, no fixed stereotype, no one way of doing things. This pluralism is reflected in the way India arranges its own affairs. All groups, faiths, tastes, ideologies survive and contend for their place in the sun. At a time when most developing countries opted for authoritarian models of governance to promote nation building and drive socio-economic development, India chose to be a multi-party democracy. And despite countless stresses and strains, perils and pressures, including during the emergency when even habeas corpus was suspended, and even during our own difficult times, a multi-party democracy, freewheeling, rumbustious, corrupt and inefficient perhaps, but nonetheless flourishing, India has remained. Now, one result is that India strikes many foreigners as maddening, chaotic, inefficient, and fractious as it muddles its way through the 3rd decade of the 21st century. Another, though, is that India is not just a country. It's an adventure, one in which all avenues are open and everything is possible. India, wrote the British historian E.P. Thompson, is perhaps the most important country for the future of the world. All the convergent influences of the world, he wrote, run through this society. There is not a thought that is being thought in the West or the East that is not active in some Indian mind, unquote. Well, I'm glad a Briton said that and not an Indian. But it's true. The Indian mind has been shaped by remarkably diverse forces: ancient Hindu tradition, myth, scripture, the impact of Islam and Christianity, and 2 centuries of British colonial rule. The result is unique. Many observers abroad have been astonished by India's survival as a pluralist state, but India could hardly have survived as anything else. Pluralism is a reality that emerges from the very nature of our country, It's a choice made inevitable by India's geography and reaffirmed by its history. Now, this means that the idea of India is itself very unusual in today's world. Talking about Indian nationhood to foreign audiences often reminds me of a perhaps apocryphal story of two law professors arguing about a particular matter. And one professor says, you know how we can solve this problem? We can do this and this and this and we can solve it. And the other law professor says, yes, 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 that will work in practice, but will it work in theory? Now, the fact is that Indian nationhood, Indian nationalism works in practice, but it doesn't work in theory. It's not based on language. I mean, all the theories of nationalism, because we have at least 22 or 35 Indian languages, depending on whether you follow the constitution or the ethno-linguists. It's not based on geography, because the natural geography of the subcontinent, framed by the Himalayas and the seas, as I said, was hacked by partition. It's not based on ethnicity, because the Indian accommodates a diversity of ethnic types, in which many Indians have more in common with so-called foreigners, ethnically, than they have with each other. So Indians have more in common ethnically with Pakistanis and Bangladeshis than they do. I mean, a Punjabi or a Bengali would have more in common with a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi than with a Poonawala or a Bangalorean. So ethnicity is also not the basis of our nationhood. And it's not based on religion either, because we are home to every faith known to mankind. And Hinduism, a faith without a national organization, no established church, no ecclesiastical hierarchy, no Hindu pope, no Hindu Mecca, no uniform beliefs or modes of worship, exemplifies as much our diversity as it does a common cultural heritage. So Indian nationalism is the nationalism of an idea. And you can argue it's the idea of a fantastical ever land, emerging from an ancient civilization, united by a shared history, and sustained by a pluralist democracy under the rule of law. Now, this land imposes no narrow conformities on its citizens. You can be many things and one thing. You can be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, a good Indian, all at once. A good Christian, a good Goan, and a good Indian all at once. I actually, in my years at the UN, part of them was spent dealing with the first the crisis and then the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, where Freudians began to note the distinctions that arise out of the narcissism of minor differences, because all these Yugoslavs are busy killing each other, but all descended from the same Slavic tribes that settled the Balkans in the 7th through 11th centuries AD. Now, that's the narcissism of minor differences. In India, we celebrate the commonality of major differences. To turn Michael Ignatieff's famous phrase on its head, we are a land of belonging rather than of blood. So one can argue the idea of India has to be that of a land, one land embracing many. It's the idea that a nation may accommodate, indeed celebrate, differences of caste, creed, color, culture, cuisine, conviction, costume, and custom, and still rally around a consensus. And that democratic consensus is around the simple principle that in a democracy, you don't really need to agree all the time, except on the ground rules of how you will disagree. The reason India has survived all the stresses and strains that have beset it for nearly 8 decades, and that led so many abroad to predict our imminent disintegration, is that we maintained consensus on how to manage without consensus. Today, those in positions of power seem to be scorning those ground rules which are enshrined alongside the idea of India in our constitution. And that's why it's imperative today more than ever to reaffirm those rules, that idea, and above all our constitution. And indeed, it's why I'm writing a short book on the constitution myself right now that will be published in May this year. Because I do believe it enshrines this idea of India. It's so vital to us. We celebrated our 77th Independence Day and the 75th anniversary of the adoption of our Constitution recently. Yet even the pomp and pageantry that accompanied these milestones could not paper over some glaring cracks, which have appeared in the fortifications of our constitutional structure and grow wider by the day, rendering the idea of India vulnerable to alarming onslaughts. It has become impossible to escape the perception that increasingly our elections are sustaining only the bare bones, a skeleton of democracy, even as its sinews are parliament, legislatures, judiciary, news media, civil society, public universities, and watchdog agencies are either hollowed out or hijacked. More pernicious still is the politics of religious hatred, the vigilantism in the name of religion, the villainizing of minorities, and the brazen communalization of our politics, polity, and public life that the Bharatiya Janata Party and its fellow travelers have enabled, and which they so sedulously encourage. Mr. Timblow referred to it as an undeclared emergency. Taken together, these trends represent indeed something like an undeclared emergency, in many ways reflecting our constitution makers' worst fears, and they challenge the idea of India, the cornerstone of our democratic republic. You know, on 25 November 1949, the eve of the adoption of the Constitution, its chief architect and principal draftsman, Dr. Ambedkar, addressed the Constituent Assembly, magisterially summarizing the work of his drafting committee. But before commending its work to the Assembly, he pointedly observed, and I quote, "However good a constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad because those who are called to work it happen to be a bad lot. However bad a constitution may be, it may turn out to be good if those who are called to work it happen to be a good lot," quote unquote. The working of the Constitution, Ambedkar pointed out, depended on how the people and the political parties work it, apply it. Constitutions are first and foremost, as Ambedkar explicitly made clear, tools to limit and restrain state power. The challenge lies in reconciling the limitations of state power with a popular mandate, thus preventing temporary majorities, because in a democracy a majority is always temporary, though some people forget that, from completely undoing what the Constitution has provided. It has been suggested that the founders of the Indian Republic held a conception of democracy that went beyond majority rule, that rejected the majoritarian premise, for they were always worried about democracy becoming an elections-only affair, and of a popular mandate degenerating into majoritarianism. They subordinated politics to law. In fact, in the Constituent Assembly, the Prime Minister and Home Minister of that time, Nehru and Patel, went to great lengths to limit their own power, a thought simply unimaginable in their counterparts today. As Ambedkar put it, and as many of us in the opposition have been saying, the rights of Indians cannot be taken away by any legislature merely because it happens to have a majority. These are Ambedkar's actual words. After all, our quest for freedom was not merely a struggle for freedom from colonial subjugation. It was an all-out revolt, symbolized by Gandhian civil disobedience and non-cooperation against a tyrannical administration of law and order. Thus was born constitutional morality, a phrase that Ambedkar brought into vogue, the legal counterpart of the idea of India, which entails a commitment to constitutional means, to its processes and structures, alongside a commitment to free speech, scrutiny of public action, and legal limitations on the exercise of power. Only if all elected representatives, public servants, and even citizens embrace this constitutional morality could freedom flourish in India. The Founding Fathers knew that with changing circumstances, the aspirations of Indians and the ways in which they could be realized would evolve. So they drafted a transformative constitution, which they equipped for all times to come with the tools that would allow us, in Gandhiji's famous phrase, to wipe every tear from every eye. Over the past decade, however, that constitution and the values it embodies, especially those of liberty, equality, and fraternity, all woven together by secularism, have been threatened. The Constitution's most seminal contribution to the idea of India, that of the primacy of individual liberty and autonomy, and of the individual, the citizen, being the true custodian of the Republic, has been brutalized. Dissent, in particular, has been villainized as anti-national, and dissidents have been charged under draconian anti-terrorism laws, particularly under the UAPA as amended by this government, which have turned the process into the punishment. This ensures that an under trial languishes endlessly in prison before being acquitted, as has occurred in, and you won't believe this, 97% of the cases filed under the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act for lack of evidence. So they file cases. There is no evidence. They don't have to bring them to trial. They don't even give them bail. Sometimes people die in prison, but those who don't die eventually are released because in 97% of the cases there is no conviction. But meanwhile they have been punished. They've lost their liberty for years. They've lost their freedom. And in many cases they lose their health, as we lost both Father Stan Swami, an infirm 84-year-old Jesuit priest, and Professor G.N. Sai Baba, a wheelchair user with over 90% disability. Their recent deaths remain a blot on our collective conscience. And what about the young student, Omar Khalid, who spent more than 4 years in jail before getting bail last week, thanks to this draconian law? As for the repressive sedition law, which has not even spared university students shouting slogans over the previous decade in India, all thanks to the loose, colonially motivated wording of the law, the BJP now claims to have jettisoned it by rehauling the Indian Penal Code. But if you take even a cursory glance at Section 152 of the new code, the new decolonized Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita, you will see that sedition has merely been split into a series of vaguely defined, stringently punishable offenses. The specter of an authoritarian, vindictive surveillance state thus continues to loom large over India, the undeclared emergency. Also evident is that numerous public-spirited and patriotic Indians have been robbed of the rule of law's protection, not to forget the fundamental rights the Constitution guarantees them, merely because they dared to question and criticize our almighty government. All of this flies in the face of our founding fathers' vision. Let us not forget that our founders, chief among them, as I said, Ambedkar and Nehru, recognized the need to impose a liberal constitution upon a decidedly illiberal society. In line with contemporary liberal thought, they committed India to the universally lauded idiom of the rule of law, constructed a state very centralized in Ambedkar's vision, rejected localism, instituted a model of representation as units for individuals rather than groups. Pursuant to this democratic setup, each and every Indian voter and citizen was supposed to exercise agency in the democratic project and could not find his situation reduced to the pre-existing loyalties of group identity or religious affiliation. The Constitution granted representation not to religion, one's predetermined identity, but to one's individual expression of agency, and that's why the vote was so important. Democratic politics cannot be reduced to the advocacy of preset interests. Instead, interests had to be expressed through politics. And the very construction of one's identity then became a form of freedom. You were not confined to describing yourself by your religion. You could be a socialist, you could be a libertarian, you could be whatever you wanted to be, a Congress party member like Datta Naik, or a BJP member for that matter. And that individuality was what defined you politically, not your religion. And this is why the Constituent Assembly rejected, in a resounding affirmation of the idea of India I've described, separate electorates, weighted representation, reservations on the basis of religion. All these were proposed in the Constituent Assembly. This fundamental difference of opinion on whether religion should be the determinant of Indian nationhood and citizenship continues to haunt our politics. What is CAA but this question indeed? Our nationalist struggle, as you know, split on this question. It was by rejecting two extremist, exclusivist ideas that our founders enshrined in the Constitution, an all-inclusive secular idea of India, which fostered a civic nationalism as against an ethno-nationalism based on religion, language, culture, and ethnicity, ensuring thus that all those who call this land their home are equal citizens with equal rights, irrespective of those other differences. Let us not forget that the two-nation theory, that revolting idea which metamorphosed into Pakistan, was not endorsed by the Muslim League alone. Even the Hindu Mahasabha and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh had long been arguing that Hindus and Muslims were two distinct nations with irreconcilable historical, religious, and cultural differences, making their coexistence in a united India impossible. Vinayak Savarkar, the father of Hindu nationalism, published his Essentials of Hindutva in 1923. M.S. Golwalkar published We or Our Nationhood Defined in 1939, just a year before he became Sarsang Chalak of the RSS. To date, the RSS provides both the sheath of cultural nationalism to the nakedly communal sword of the BJP and the springboard into public life for numerous votaries of Hindutva. Little wonder then that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and most of his cabinet colleagues started out as young men in the local RSS shakha, swishing about in white shirts and khaki shorts and brandishing lathis as part of their paramilitary drills, all reflective of Hindutva's reverence for the fascist movements of pre-World War II Europe. So Hindutva, as I have argued, is not only un-Indian, it's un-Hindu. It flies in the face of the sprawling faiths. It's more a conglomerate of countless beliefs and ways of life and worship than a single sort of one God, one prayer book, one religion kind of concept. Hinduism, in fact, can seamlessly coexist with different religions because it always has believed, as Swami Vivekananda so magnificently articulated, that ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti, that there is only one truth, but are very many different ways of seeing it. In fact, Swami Vivekananda loved reciting the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which says that just as many rivers flow, some straight, some winding, some down hills, some down valleys, but end up in the same sea, so also all ways of worship of all religions end up with the same divine. The Hindu might call it Brahman, somebody else may call it God, Jehovah, Allah. It didn't matter. It was all the same thing. That was the fundamental Hindu belief. And this kind of credo is what led Swami Vivekananda to argue that the strength of Hinduism is it not merely tolerated other faiths, it accepted them. That difference between acceptance and tolerance was central to the Hinduism that he preached and, of course, that Gandhiji followed. And I must say that this has made, in many ways, this spirit of inclusiveness and the idea of India possible. It made unity in diversity the most hallowed of modern India's self-defining slogans. In stark contrast, Hindutvavadis envisioned and envision an India where Hindus alone are supreme and where Muslims and Christians can only live on the sufferance of the majority. On the other extreme of the spectrum of religious bigotry, of course, Muhammad Ali Jinnah capitalized on Muslim anxieties about this quest for a Hindu-only India, and intensifying his hate-mongering in the aftershock of the League's poor showing in the provincial elections of 1937, he sought to instill in Muslims a fear of being subjugated by a belligerent Hindu majority once the British departed. That's what led to the Lahore Resolution of 1940, officially demanding Pakistan, which after 45 had driven a decisive, irretrievable nail in the coffin of a united and undivided India. Now, in deference to India's civilizationally capacious character, our greatest patriots, including, of course, led by Mahatma Gandhi, rejected both these extremes, refusing to accept the logic of the pernicious two-nation theory and reaffirming the idea of India I've described to you all. While the demands for a Hindu-only Bharat and a Muslim-only Pakistan were, in their view, unnatural and inorganic, the idea of India, pluralist India, had always existed. In fact, it had been first codified going back to the Motilal Nehru Report of 1928, India's first serious attempt at drafting a constitution of her own, 19 years before independence. Neither the framers of this report, which was drafted by the Indian National Congress and several other parties in committee, nor of the Constitution of India 2 decades later, accepted separate electorates on religious grounds. This is why the Muslim League rejected the Nehru Report. And in the constitutional case, as you know, the League boycotted the meetings of the Assembly and eventually left it. As the constitutional scholar Granville Austin had observed, many of the trailblazing initiatives of the Indian Constitution, including universal adult franchise and unassailable fundamental rights, can be found in this report going back to 1928, a year where our colonizers only just had extended the vote to women in their home island. And as you know, the United States, hailed as the world's oldest modern democracy, did not even grant universal adult suffrage, which we were able to, independent India was able to do in its very first election. They didn't really do it until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So all of these, frankly, suggest that even as our founding fathers grappled with a succession of cataclysms, this idea of India was always in their mind. Whether it was colonization, the carnage of partition, the arrival in India of countless refugees, the invasion of Kashmir, the unification of the princely states, all of these things happened while the Constitution was being written. But they never abandoned the idea of India. They never forgot the lessons of the Nehru Report, the Karachi Resolution, and of course, when they finally adopted a constitution for India as a sovereign secular republic, they decided it would be a country for everyone, reflecting the very values I've described to you. Pakistan, an Islamic republic, has a constitutional order that strictly has to be consistent with Islam. It is condemned to second-class status its minorities, who are not only discriminated against, their passports are stamped non-Muslim in Pakistan. I've seen Pakistani passports bearing that stamp, almost like the Star of David had to be worn by Jews under Nazi rule. That's what the Pakistani passport is like. We've never been like that. Our founders never accepted the argument that because Pakistan had been created as that kind of country, a so-called homeland for the subcontinent's Muslims, that India should be turned into a Hindu Rashtra, a reflection, a sort of Hindu Pakistan. No, our far-seeing founders came down firmly in support of the idea that being Indian had nothing to do with religion, everything to do with considering oneself Indian by virtue of birth and upbringing and belonging, a sense of belonging. That's why the title of my book about Indian nationalism is The Battle of Belonging. And whoever considered themselves Indians, they affirmed, were entitled to equal rights and privileges. Article 1 of our Constitution proclaims India to be a union of states, and nowhere, our founding fathers said, in this union was there space for any exclusionary, extremist, or ethno-nationalist state. So they created a pluralist, multi-party democracy where religion was not the determinant of nationhood and citizenship, and all Indians were free to do their own bidding and dream their own dreams. For these dreams they often strove together as comrades in a common cause, and when they succeeded in all their diversity, India triumphed. In the years following independence, the most glowing illustration of this was the Indo-Pakistan War of 1971. It broke out when I was still in high school. My final year, I'd taken my closing exams, and the war broken out. And in a breathtaking display of recklessness, the Pakistani generals declared a jihad on the Hindu unbeliever, only to get trounced by a military led by a Parsi, General Manekshaw, an air force with an assistant chief of air staff who was Muslim, Air Chief Marshal Latif, who went on to become chief of air staff. In East Pakistan, where this liberation war was fought, the general officer in charge of the Eastern Command was a Sikh, Jasdeep Singh Arora, and finally the general we helicoptered into Dhaka to negotiate the terms of surrender of the Pakistani army was Jewish, Major General J.F.R. Jacob. That was India. That was the India they were declaring a jihad against. And you know, I've been to the island of Diu, since you're all in Goa, and you have a common colonial history there. You should go, if you haven't already, and look at the memorial to the only ship we lost in that 71 war, the INS Kukri, which sank with all hands on board. Captain Mullah, in command of the ship, went down with the others. At this memorial, they've done something remarkable. They've listed the name of every single Jawan and sailor who died. And as the Kukri went down to its watery grave, you see every religion of India, every region of India represented there as a tangible testament, which brings tears to one's eyes and swells one's heart with pride that nobody has a monopoly on the idea of India, that everyone belonging to every faith in this wonderful country of ours has shed their blood and sacrificed their lives to preserve and protect our future. But for those who claim to try to seek to create a new India, this old idea of India is repugnant. Their conception of an Amrit Kal is premised on India belonging only to people of their faith. The India of 1971, the India of Ambedkar, Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, to whom Ishwar and Allah were but different names for the same Almighty. And Gandhiji, don't forget, was shot dead for defending the plural and peaceful idea of India. This appalls our ruling party. Petrified of the power of a united people, they have sought to divide us on communal lines. Why else would the ruling party on the campaign trail last year in 24, launch a savage assault on our republic's religious pluralism? Addressing a rally in Rajasthan, the Prime Minister described Muslims as infiltrators and thundered that when the Congress party was last in power, it made Muslims the foremost recipient of India's resources. He declared that the Congress and its allies would snatch away the Hindu majority's hard-earned wealth and give it to Muslims, sparing not even the Mangal Sutras of their mothers and sisters, and adding that they would redistribute wealth to Muslims, described as those who have more children, and even promote Sharia law. Electoral politics aside, this disgraceful scaremongering about 200 million of his fellow citizens, all of whom he is constitutionally pledged to serve, was in keeping with the Hindu chauvinist doctrine the Prime Minister imbibed in his childhood and youth, and which he sadly reflects. And when the Prime Minister himself leads this reprehensible communal chorus, others, perhaps in a bid to ingratiate themselves with the powers that be, do not remain far behind. Even in some cases, judges and some judges, who are supposed to be the custodians of our rule of law and equality before the law. All of you would be aware that during the recently concluded winter session of Parliament, a motion for the impeachment of a prominent High Court judge was sought to be introduced in both houses. Not only did this sworn defender of justice, upon whom it's incumbent to be fair and just, preside over a communal gathering, he went so far to say at that gathering that India should be run along the wishes of the majority community, and employed a loathsome expletive to refer to our Muslim fellow citizens. And this, mind you, is only the most flagrant instance of a sitting judge vilifying the minority community. Hindutva has always sought to wrest power in the present by waging war after war on the past. The battlefield of history suits them to distract the public, even though exacting revenge on history and reversing historical injustices, both real and imagined, only begets new injustices in the present, punishing those who for no fault of theirs happen to share the historical aggressor's fate. In the process, they denuded of the protection of the idea of India and stripped of their rights as free and equal citizens. Today, across courts in our country, lawsuits are pending that demand the conversion of some mosque or the other to a temple. In fact, not just mosques, even such abodes of spirituality and syncretism as the Ajmer Sharif Dargah have come under attack, with wild claims swirling about their having been built on the ruins of temples. And while the Prime Minister, in an appreciable display of religious eclecticism, has sent a chadar to Ajmer, to Dargah Sharif just yesterday, he has not said a single word against this preposterous demand to turn it back into a temple. In Uttar Pradesh alone, 18 such lawsuits are pending. Coupled with the Supreme Court's reluctance so far to uphold once and for all the Places of Worship Act as sacrosanct and unassailable, the path as of now to a new India, a new Bharat, seems littered with the wreckage of that old and noble idea of India. We have already witnessed a partition in the Indian soil. If this madness continues, we could witness a partition of the Indian soul, which in my view would be no less devastating. At this somber juncture in our nation's journey, we have just mourned the loss of one of modern India's greatest architects, who, having revolutionized our economy by tugging it out of socialist stagnation, recently passed into history, depriving India of one of her last Nehruvian statesmen. Yet it would be remiss of us to eulogize Dr. Manmohan Singh as only an economic liberator, one who redefined the economic idea of India and in so doing lifted millions out of poverty. The fact is that much like Dr. Ambedkar, this Dr. Sahib believed that if India is truly to flourish, equality must not only be political, it must also be economic and social. So he set himself the task as Prime Minister for a decade of expanding the idea of India and drawing its protective socio-economic cover over millions of Indians who till then had woefully resided on the margins of our national consciousness. He pulled 10 million people out of poverty every year. 1 crore crossed that line, the poverty line, which is defined so low in our country. Then, under Dr. Singh's stewardship, we enacted both the Right to Education Act of 2009, bringing a record number of children to school and pumping resources into classrooms, and the Right to Information Act of 2005, which shored up the participatory nature of our democracy, empowered our citizenry, and made public officials more accountable. Not only this, he presided over the opening of millions of new bank accounts, strengthened rural purchasing power through the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and introduced the Aadhaar scheme that today gives every Indian a digital identity. As he stepped away after years of industrious service in 2014, he left behind an idea of India more vital and vigorous than he had found it. In the fractured and fractious times of today, when hatred, not social transformation, is the recurring theme, his is an example worth following. Standing here before all of you, my heart swells with gratitude for this man who, through his steadfast and selfless service, exhorted every Indian, transforming India in the process. As one who had the invaluable privilege of knowing him and working alongside him, I bow my head in pranam to this truly great soul. And yet, on a day we celebrate the 70th birthday of Datta Naik, I want to say we must not lose hope. Over the past 5 years, democracy and liberty-loving citizens of India have risen to reclaim our republic. Rescuing the Constitution of India from the highbrow preserves of courtrooms, legal chambers, and academia, they've mobilized it and sent it to battle. In the biting cold of December 2019 and early 2020, before COVID, lakhs of Indians across the country, youngsters, students, old, feeble, yet indomitable women of Shaheen Bagh, poured into the streets in protest against the sickening Citizenship Amendment Act and National Register of Citizens, which, when read together, gave color to the two-nation theory by excluding Muslims alone from fast-track citizenship for citizens of neighboring countries. Even though the state cracked down hard on them, storming the universities of peacefully protesting students, assaulting them, and even though over 60 people have died in the ensuing violence in Delhi alone the following year, the foot soldiers of our Constitution never gave up. On those freezing nights, wrapped in fog, countless Indians of all faiths and castes, speaking numerous languages, held aloft portraits of Ambedkar, Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, chanted the preamble in unison as one people. And as the electrifying cry of "We the People" ripped through the darkness, the idea of India roared back to life, revitalizing our republic and promising to awaken us into that heaven of freedom that Tagore so memorably wrote about. So if there's one thing you take away from this felicitation of Dr. Datta Naik, let it be this, that the idea of India, as is his idea of India, was, is, and forever shall be a labor of love. It demands toil. It demands incessant striving. It demands a resolve of steel. And above all, it demands that we never forget a simple fact. It was only after enduring over a century of unimaginable horrors and brutalities, trials and tribulations, that we gained freedom and began scripting our nation's destiny with our own hands. We transformed India from an immeasurably impoverished, illiterate, and sometimes most baffling democracy into the world's most astonishing, most diverse, most plural land. While momentous and majestic, this is not an achievement we can ever take for granted. We must always remain vigilant, watching out for dangers to our democratic and secular well-being, and shouldering sincerely the duties of citizenship. Because ultimately the founders of modern India, who undertook the greatest constitutional enterprise, perhaps since the one in Philadelphia in 1787, bequeathed this eternal land and the idea of India not to politicians. They bequeathed it to the citizens of India, to you and us, me, all of us here, making us all the custodians of this robust and resilient republic. With these words, I'd like to join you all in wishing Dr. Datta Naik a wonderful 70th and many more decades of service to follow. Thank you so much, and Jai Hind.
Thank you, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, for a really, truly inspirational speech. I can assure you that all those who have listened to you today will never give up hope.